I'll give the floor, doy ahora la palabra.
I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I thank USG Di Carlo for her factual briefing and looking forward to the briefing by the acting ASG Ratuate. The Council's attention must not waver from Russia's barbaric war against Ukrainian civilians. On 1st and 2nd June, Russia launched its most destructive aerial assaults to date, with 656 drones and 73 missiles. The attacks killed 23 civilians and injured 145. In Kyiv alone, 11 education and 5 medical facilities were damaged. Just yesterday, a Russian drone struck the central spent nuclear fuel storage facility in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. We were a few hundred meters away from a highly dangerous disaster. The evidence is overwhelming. Every verified statistic and every UN report shows a continued escalation of Russia's attacks against Ukrainian civilians. In the first quarter of 2026, Ukraine has seen 190 attacks on healthcare facilities, including maternity hospitals. Over 200 educational institutions have been damaged or destroyed. Child casualties increased by a horrifying 49%. Statistics for May will be even worse. Early reporting indicates that May was the deadliest month for civilians since April 2022. Among the so-called Russia's legitimate targets were grieving families attending a funeral in Sumy. Last week, Russian armed and security forces were listed by the UN for the systemic use of conflict-related sexual violence against prisoners of war and civilian detainees. Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has previously reported that 98.9% of freed detainees disclosed being tortured while in Russian custody. 63% of them multiple times. Mr. President, we are calling meeting after meeting in an effort to bring a permanent member of the UN Security Council to its senses. And every time we deliver the same stark message. Russia, stop killing civilians and humanitarian workers. Stop your war of aggression. Yet Russia continues to reject reality. Despite Russia's over 1.37 million military casualties since the start of the invasion, averaging roughly 35,000 a month in 2025, Russia refuses to accept the failure of the war it started and is increasingly resorting to illicit recruitment, manipulation and coercion of individuals from Africa, the Americas and Asia to send them to the front lines. Russia is unable to sustain recruitment at a level sufficient to replace its casualties. Russia's war economy is systematically degrading. Inflation is vastly underreported. Banking crisis is looming. The current budget shortfall already at this point is at 150% of what the Russian Ministry of Finance had forecast for the entire year. Private businesses are now also expected to directly finance the war efforts, and things will only get worse for Russia. Ukraine is growing stronger, and it has the innovation edge. Ukraine has become a security provider for Europe and for partners in the Gulf. Ukraine is succeeding in liberating territory. When will Russia understand that this war of aggression is going nowhere? Mr. President, no one wants peace more than Ukraine. In the last few days, the President of Ukraine has publicly and officially reiterated his call for a ceasefire and talks. His letter was derided and rejected by the President of Russia. This reconfirms publicly what we already know. Russia does not want to talk. It doesn't want a ceasefire, no peace, and Russia is the sole obstacle to peace. Latvia supports the principles and the way forward as stated by the leaders of France, the United Kingdom and Germany on June 7, yesterday. and our support for Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence remains ironclad. Russia started this war. Russia can end it by stopping its attacks on civilians, withdrawing its forces, and leaving Ukraine's sovereign territory. Enough is enough. The time for the ceasefire is now. Thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the delegation of Latvia for their statement, and with the understanding of other members of the council, we will try again with Mr. Radwat. Please go ahead.
But we are unable to hear you again. We're unable to hear you. So we're gonna...
Can you hear us?
Now we do. Please, go ahead. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, building on the political and security developments outlined by my colleague from the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, allow me to highlight the humanitarian realities we are seeing across Ukraine. The past week has brought another surge in civilian casualties and suffering. Between last Friday and the early hours of today, at least 30 civilians were reported killed and over 200 injured across Ukraine. Civilians, including families and children, have been killed in their homes, injured on their way to work, and cut off from essential services. The scale and intensity of the attacks on major centers is increasing. Strikes have hit cities, including Dnipro, Kiev, bringing the war further into populated urban areas. Communities are still grappling with the consequences of the 2nd June attack on Kiev, one of the most significant attacks on the capital since February 2022. Hospitals, schools, humanitarian personnel and premises, including a UN office in Kiev, were impacted. Along the front line, attacks continue to kill and injure civilians, damage homes and essential civilian infrastructure, and force families to make impossible choices. Stay and risk your life or leave everything behind. We are also concerned by reports of civilian casualties in the occupied territories of Ukraine. Wherever hostilities occur, the result is the same: more civilian suffering. Humanitarian workers are not insulated from these attacks. Over the weekend, in government-controlled Kherson region, 7 humanitarian vehicles were damaged during several attacks, injuring aid workers and volunteers and damaging clearly marked humanitarian assets. Last week, in the government-controlled Donetsk region, a vehicle belonging to a humanitarian organization was struck and heavily damaged while supporting civilians affected by the war. It follows a series of incidents that have been reported to this council in the recent weeks. So far this year, 3 humanitarian workers have been killed and 32 injured. Such attacks are unacceptable. International humanitarian law is very clear. Civilians and civilian objects, including humanitarian personnel and assets, must be protected. These rules exist to limit suffering and preserve dignity precisely when there is war, and they must be respected. Accountability for violations and measures to prevent them are essential. Mr. President, the humanitarian consequences of hostilities extend well beyond immediate civilian harm. They are measured in communities becoming harder to reach, harder to support with assistance, and harder to protect. When humanitarian operations are interrupted and impeded, supplies don't get through, life-saving services are suspended, humanitarian evacuations come to a halt, and civilians lose a lifeline. The impact is immediate and the consequences can be deadly. Mr. President, in frontline areas, our humanitarian partners continue to evacuate civilians who wish to leave and to deliver essential assistance, but our ability to do so is shrinking. Hostilities, including the growing use of armed drones, create a daily dilemma: how to remain present where needs are greatest while keeping humanitarian personnel and assets safe. If humanitarians stay away, some communities become progressively more isolated, cut off from medical care, protection services, humanitarian assistance, and evacuation support precisely when they need them the most. Mr. President, international humanitarian law is unequivocal in demanding the protection of civilians and the facilitation of rapid, unimpeded humanitarian relief for civilians in need wherever they are. In line with this, our own offer remains unchanged. OCHA is ready to work discreetly with both parties on practical humanitarian arrangements that help civilians who are trapped along the front lines receive aid and voluntarily move to safer areas. Time is of the essence to reduce suffering and improve humanitarian access. Mr. President, Ukraine remains one of the world's largest humanitarian crises. Today, 10.8 million people require humanitarian assistance. Yet, we have received less than half the funding needed to reach them. We recognize the enormous pressures on humanitarian budgets as crises continue to emerge and deepen around the world. But the needs in Ukraine have not diminished. For communities in need, funding is the difference between help reaching them or not. It allows humanitarian organizations to remain present, respond rapidly, and support those facing the greatest risks. Mr. President, my asks to this Council are straightforward. First, use all your influence to reverse the erosion of the protection of civilians. Do not allow this level of civilian harm and suffering to become the new normal. Second, help preserve and expand our humanitarian operations to reach civilians in need wherever they are. Where access is possible, it must be safeguarded. Where it is impeded, it is vital to open it. Thirdly, ensure humanitarian organizations have the funding needed to remain present where the needs are greatest. Mr. President, the war continues to cause deep suffering for millions of people across Ukraine. But suffering must be reduced. Civilians must be protected and lives must be saved. We urge all those with influence, please use it. I thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank Mr. Ratwat for his briefing, and we will now hear statements from council members once again. I now give the floor to the delegation of Denmark.
President. And I thank Under-Secretary General Di Carlo and Acting Assistant Secretary General Ratwat for their briefings. Mr. President, for the fifth time in just 20 days, the Security Council has convened to urgently address the humanitarian suffering caused by Russia's unprovoked and illegal invasion of its peaceful neighbor, Ukraine. 2 weeks ago, the Secretary General made a strong appeal in this chamber for the international community to stop the war before it spirals further out of control. Since then, we have only seen a further escalation by Russia. And then last week, again in this chamber, Russia issued the chilling threat that it would launch systematic attacks on Ukraine's capital. On this occasion, regrettably, Russia kept its word. In the night between the 1st and 2nd of June, this threat became a reality for the civilians of Ukraine. The skies above Kharkiv, Dnipro, and in particular above Kyiv, lit up once again with hundreds of Russian-fired missiles and drones. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission witnessed this devastation firsthand. The reports are of at least 22 civilians killed and 145 injured. We are also seeing a deeply concerning increase in attacks on or close to Ukraine's nuclear power plants, including Zaporizhzhia and the decommissioned Chernobyl plant. Denmark supports the IAEA's warning that attacks on nuclear sites are completely unacceptable and directly contravene key nuclear safety principles. Mr. President, let me return once again to the fundamental tenets of international humanitarian law, because these pillars stand firmly and unchanged. So thus, their importance. We repeat our demand that international humanitarian law be fully respected, without exception. We similarly demand
also without exception, full accountability and justice for all the crimes committed in this war of choice launched by Russia. However, what we've seen is the exact opposite. Another Russian attack on Ukraine's cities that completely disregard international humanitarian law. Compared to the same period in 2025, which was already the deadliest war for Ukrainian civilians since 2022, casualties are 20% higher this year, 2026. Russia alone has the power to end this humanitarian suffering immediately, while Ukraine has no choice but to defend itself, to fight for its existence as a sovereign and independent state. Mr. President, Russia's cynical tactics are clearly meant to force Ukraine into submission, but Russia has no military path to victory. Its unprovoked invasion of a neighboring state, its attempt to overthrow a democratically elected government, and its plan to redraw internationally recognized borders by force have all failed. Ukraine has been offering an immediate, unconditional, and comprehensive ceasefire for well over a year. We all know that the only solution is a permanent ceasefire to allow for good faith negotiation aimed at a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. And just last week, President Zelensky again called for an end to the war. The longer Russia denies reality, the longer civilians will be killed and injured. The international community must pressure Russia to halt its invasion and end the terrible human suffering. Until that moment, Denmark reaffirms its steadfast support to Ukraine, along with our partners. I thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of Denmark for their statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of France. Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo and ASG Mr. Indrika Ratwat for their statements which confirm the continuation of Russia's irresponsible escalation in its war of aggression against Ukraine. Mr. President, this council is meeting for the 5th time in 20 days to speak about the consequences of Russia's decision to persist in this escalation. On the evening from the 1st to the 2nd of June, Russia carried out new strikes against major Ukrainian cities and specifically its capital, with 656 drones and 73 missiles. These strikes killed over 20 civilians and injured over 100. Moreover, after Russia's strike against the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in February of 2025, a drone once again attacked this especially sensitive site yesterday, which is a threat for the nuclear safety of the area. Mr. President, France stands with the people of Ukraine in the face of these new attacks. In the 5th year of this high-intensity war launched by Moscow, this situation is intolerable, and our support to the legitimate resistance of Ukraine will continue to be unshakable in our national capacity and with our partners. Russia will not win. Mr. President, in a meeting yesterday in London, leaders from France, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Ukraine reaffirmed their support to the goal of putting an end to this war through negotiations. They recalled the parameters of a just and lasting peace, especially with regards to the refusal to modify international borders by force and solid security guarantees that should be afforded to Ukraine. In this context, President Zelensky's call to negotiate directly with President Putin is to be welcomed, and members of the Council should support it. Specifically, Europe and the United States should fully support this dialogue. Mr. President, as the Secretary General of the United Nations recalled here and supported by the vast majority of member states, the very first step on the road to peace is an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire. Ukraine proposed it about 15 months ago, and until now, Russia has consistently refused, even refusing to prolong several partial ceasefires in the past few months. Mr. President, in the face of this escalation that affects more Ukrainian civilians each week, our message is clear. Enough is enough. We need a ceasefire now. I thank you. I thank the delegation of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of the United Kingdom. I apologize, Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to start by thanking you for convening this meeting, and Under Secretary General Di Carlo and Acting Assistant Secretary General Atwate for their remarks. Mr. President, we are meeting for the 5th time in less than 3 weeks, noted by other speakers also. Following another wave of massive aerial attacks Russia launched against Kiev and Dnipro, and other peaceful urban centers across Ukraine, such as Zaporizhia, Sumy, Chernihiv, Poltava, and Kharkiv, destroying or damaging homes, businesses, healthcare, and educational facilities. As announced this afternoon, a new wave of attacks across Ukraine since Friday caused scores of deaths and injuries among civilians, affecting also international organizations, particularly in Kherson. We are witnessing the continuation of this pattern of escalation of hostilities against civilians. Russia itself has repeatedly prepared us for the consistent and systematic nature of these attacks. The human toll is by now well documented. We deplore that. Once more, children, the most vulnerable group and in need of specific protection, are among the casualties. We also note the severe nature of these attacks, including double-tap strikes, which cause casualties also among emergency workers. International humanitarian law is built upon the foundational principles of distinction, proportionality, precaution, and military necessity, which prohibit attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. We condemn their blatant violation, and we stress that parties to a conflict must take all feasible precautions to protect the civilian population and civilian objects under their control. We are also deeply concerned about latest incidents affecting nuclear safety, such as the strike against storage facility for spent nuclear fuel near Ukraine's Chernobyl power plant. Mr. President, the emerging message from this vicious circle of violence is now clearer than ever. Russia must cease its aggression immediately and agree to a full, comprehensive, and sustainable ceasefire that will be based on international law, the UN Charter, as well as on credible and robust security arrangements. That will preclude the recurrence of war and ensure an independent, democratic, and sovereign future for Ukraine. The choice has been available since the launch of the US-led peace efforts last year, the bilateral engagement between Ukraine and Russia, and Ukraine's own agreement to a ceasefire. We call on Russia to finally make it. In conclusion, Mr. President, the only way forward is not through escalation and explicit or implicit threats to expand the war to the wider region. That risks further destabilization and a spillover effect of violence that could spiral out of control, but through more dialogue and diplomacy. Negotiations must be based on full respect of international law and the principles of sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all states. I thank you.
Doy las gracias.
I thank the delegation of Greece for their statement. And I give the floor to the delegation of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And thank you to the briefers who have outlined the devastation caused by Russia's latest attacks. Attacks which Russia threatened in this very chamber. In the assault on the 1st and 2nd June, Russia launched 656 drones and 73 missiles across Ukraine, including a record total of 41 ballistic and hypersonic missiles. These are not isolated incidents, but part of a sustained and escalating pattern of Russian aerial attacks on Ukrainian cities, costing civilian lives across Ukraine. Latest reports indicate that in this assault, at least 23 civilians were killed, including 2 young boys aged under 10 years old, and more than 130 people injured. Every civilian death in this war is a tragedy. Russia continues to strike towns and cities across Ukraine, repeatedly damaging homes, schools, and hospitals, destroying the very places where people should feel safest. Recent reports have also shown strikes impacting on humanitarian personnel and facilities, as well as damaging residential buildings and civilian infrastructure in several regions. These attacks not only cause immediate destruction, but are also intended to inflict deep, long-lasting mental harm and sustained pressure on Ukraine's civilian population. A cruel attempt to force their capitulation. Of course, none of this would be happening if Russia had not launched an unprovoked invasion against a sovereign state, now in its 5th year. Russia could end this war today by withdrawing, but instead, Russia escalates attacks while suffering increasing setbacks on the battlefield, growing ever more desperate. We welcome President Zelensky's call for a full ceasefire and a diplomatic end to the war, most recently set out in his open letter to President Putin. President Putin should now respond by engaging in serious, meaningful peace talks. Yesterday, my Prime Minister, alongside the leaders of Ukraine, France, and Germany, expressed condolences for the victims of Russia's attacks. They reiterated our collective commitment to stand firmly with Ukraine in search of a diplomatic solution to Russia's continued aggression. This pattern of attacks from Russia shows a disregard for civilian life and for the protections of international law and the UN Charter. The Russian Federation bears full responsibility for this war, and President Zelensky has repeatedly offered diplomatic solutions. Enough is enough. A comprehensive ceasefire is long overdue. Thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the delegation of the United Kingdom for the statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Panama. Thank you, President. We would like to thank Madam Rosemary DiCarlo, Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, as well as Mr. Indrika Ratwat, Acting Assistant Secretary General for OCHA, for sharing detailed information about recent events in the conflict in Ukraine. We recognize the participation of the distinguished delegations that have joined us in the room, and we would also like to welcome Her Excellency Elina Valtonen, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Finland, that honors us with her presence here today. In the past few weeks, we have sustained several debates on events that continue to develop intensely in the context of the conflict in Ukraine, characterized by persistent violence, which increases international concern. President, we have received information on strikes against several cities in Ukraine that have caused lethal victims and left many wounded. Moreover, attacks against critical infrastructure in the Russian Federation have been reported. We are especially concerned by the possible spread of hostilities to neighboring countries, with the ensuing risk of escalation and deterioration of international security. Panama notes a trend that cannot be normalized: the growing acceptance of damages to civilians as an inevitable consequence of hostilities. We reiterate the obligation of all parties in conflict to distinguish at all times between military targets and civilians, and to adopt all possible precautions in order to avoid direct and indirect damages to innocent populations. Protecting civilians does not allow for exceptions, justifications, or convenient interpretations. There is no room for relativism with regards to this obligation under any circumstances. President, the Security Council has received information on several incidents, some of them verified by the United Nations, and others that still remain unverified due to access restrictions. Given the seriousness of the allegations, it is critical to have trustworthy information that allows us to determine the facts and avoid contradictory versions. Therefore, Panama reiterates the need to carry out independent and impartial investigations and to ensure unrestricted and safe access to the places where the facts actually happened in order to verify information and promote accountability on the basis of international law. President, the unprecedented level of human suffering, especially among innocent civilians, should lead us to reflect on the justifications to continue with this bloody war that from the beginning started with a violation of international law and international humanitarian law. Once again, in an additional meeting that has now become routine every month, we urge all actors that have influence on the parties to use it in order to have political and diplomatic will when it comes to the use of force. We reiterate once again that the parties should commit without delay to a full, unconditional, and lasting ceasefire as an indispensable step towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict, grounded in a firm and credible commitment to fully respect the United Nations Charter. I thank you. I thank the delegation of Panama for the statement, and I now give the floor to the delegation of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, today we have yet once again gathered at the UN Security Council at the initiative of the Permanent Mission of Ukraine and its European sponsors. In recent years, such meetings have become a routine element of the anti-Russian information campaign, and they do not carry any positive element and do not bring the settlement of the crisis any closer. I would like to ask the European sponsors, aren't you yourselves tired of hearing and saying the same thing? European delegations, at the behest of the Ukrainians, can convene the Council every day if they want, compete with each other in hypocrisy or anti-Russian rhetoric, express solidarity with Kiev, talk about the need to protect democracy and international law, and fabricate unsubstantiated insinuations, as was the case today when you referred to Chernobyl. You should take a look at what was said about this by the IAEA Director General Grossi. But there is a problem. All these words are devoid of any connection with reality because Western countries, which talk most about humanism and the suffering of civilians, showed exactly a week ago their true colors. When there was the incident involving a UAV in Romania and Galati, unfounded accusations against Russia from the leadership of the UN, NATO, and EU member states have followed immediately. They were also voiced during the meeting of the Security Council, where also words of solidarity were expressed with the victims in Romania. Expressing sympathy for the victims is a normal human reaction. And we certainly do not say anything against that. A similar incident occurred the other day in the seaport of Constanta, where a sea drone exploded, and thereafter, immediately, without any justification, Russia was blamed. But not because the drone was Russian, but because it was Russia that had allegedly initially attacked Ukraine. I would like to emphasize here that it was clear from the very beginning that we were talking about a Ukrainian maritime drone, which the Kiev regime planned to use to carry out terrorist acts against civilian ships, as was done in Greece, by the way, which is something that Greece is being silent about at Security Council meetings. So, to carry out terrorist acts against civilian ships and threaten the safety of navigation in the Black Sea. So, where there is a request for an extraordinary meeting of the Security Council in the wake of that, where are the fiery speeches from the Romanian foreign minister? All we hear is silence. And where are all these European champions of international humanitarian law? Where were they just a few weeks ago when the Zelensky regime in cold blood killed 21 students and injured more than 40 others in a terrorist drone strike on the academic building and dormitory of a college in Starobelsk? The lives of very young girls and boys was cut short in an instant. Even after information about the tragedy spread around the world, the self-proclaimed beacons of democracy continued to defend and shield the Kiev junta. They could not squeeze out even elementary words of sympathy for the families of the victims. And this is not even double standards, but rather a system of politically selecting human sufferings. Some victims are declared worthy of sympathy. Others are deliberately removed from the information space when the goal is to whitewash the Zelensky regime and blacken Russia. As we expected, the Kiev regime did not stop there and committed another bloody crime. On the 3rd of June, in the center of the Yenakievo urban district in the Donetsk People's Republic, a regular passenger bus, Moscow-Simferopol, was fired upon. Its interior burnt out completely. 7 people were killed and 11, including 1 child, were injured. After the shelling, reconnaissance drones of the armed forces of Ukraine were seen in the skies over the scenes of the tragedy. They were there to record the consequences of their war crime. The deaths of people in Starobilsk and Yenakievo are a small share of the atrocities committed by the militants of the Kiev regime. They daily hit civilian objects in border areas. They inflict precision-targeted strikes on residential buildings, educational and medical institutions, and they hunt for civilians. Just now, the armed forces of Ukraine have struck the Moscow-Simferopol passenger train. The assistant driver was killed. Was this a military facility in any way? For the period from 25th to 31st of May, 217 Russian civilians were injured by shelling from the armed forces of Ukraine. 35 people were killed, including 3 children. 182 were injured, including 8 minors. 3,754 rounds of munitions were fired at civilian targets. And naturally, Western countries and the UN Secretariat preferred not to notice these deaths. We demand that the UN Secretary General strongly condemn these crimes committed by the militants of the Zelensky regime against civilians in Starobilsk and Yenakievo. Silence, verbal juggling, and avoiding a direct assessment of the crimes of the armed forces of Ukraine are tantamount to encouraging a policy of terror against civilians. Mr. President, in response to the terrorist attacks on Starobilsk, as well as a number of other strikes by the armed forces of Ukraine on civilians and civilian objects, the Russian armed forces strike with high-precision weapons at enterprises of the military-industrial complex, fuel and transport infrastructure facilities of Ukraine, which are used in the interests of the armed forces of Ukraine, as well as against military airfields. As a result, 10 enterprises producing military products, including attack UAVs, have recently been hit in Kiev. They include the APT Association, the Spectre Special Design Bureau Enterprise of the radio electronic industry, Mayak Plant Company, and the state company Spetsexpert. Also in Kiev, 3 territorial recruitment centers for the armed forces of Ukraine were hit. In Zaporozhye, a blow was struck at the workshops of the Amelchenko machine building plant and the Motor Sich aircraft engine plant. In the Dnipropetrovsk region, at the enterprises of the Firepoint Company, they produce components for the long-range attack UAVs and missile weapons, as well as against the logistics centers. In the Kharkiv region, against 3 defense industry enterprises, including the Kharkiv State Aviation Enterprise and 2 facilities of the fuel and energy complex of Ukraine used by the armed forces of Ukraine. In the Sumy region, against the Shotska state-owned plant Zvezda. Strikes were also carried out on military industry enterprises in the Khmelnytsky and Poltava regions and the infrastructure of 6 military airfields in the Cherkasky, Rovno, Zhytomyr, Kirovograd, Khmelnytsky, and Kiev regions. Unlike the Kiev regime, which not only shells peaceful targets in Russia, but also deliberately uses civilian infrastructure and its population as a human shield, the Russian armed forces hit only military targets and facilities used in the interests of the armed forces of Ukraine. The casualties that occur amongst the civilian population of Ukraine are the result of a disorderly and chaotic work of the Ukrainian air defense, which, in violation of the IHL, is deployed in residential areas. Mr. President, for 12 years after as a result of a bloody coup d'etat with the direct support of Western countries, the situation in country is getting worse and worse. In fact, what is happening is the destruction of the Ukrainian people. Millions have left the country. Hundreds of thousands were killed, driven like cattle to war with Russia. It is becoming more and more difficult to forcibly mobilize people, and that's why in Europe they started talking about abolishing the temporary protection status for Ukrainians of military age. Through Zelensky's efforts, a multi-million country has been turned into expendable material in the senseless crusade of Western Russophobic elites against Russia. In Ukraine, there have always been many politicians who, maneuvering between the West and Russia, tried to sit on two chairs at the same time. However, the bet was made on Zelensky, apparently because he was ready to exchange the future of his country for handouts from Westerners in the form of material benefits for himself and his entourage. And the corruption scandals of recent months have revealed that. Did you not ask yourselves why this was not followed for a clear reaction from Western countries? The answer here is simple. Western countries are ready to pay this price, to personally enrich Zelensky and his henchmen, just so that he doesn't stop the war. But at the same time, it must be understood that the so-called collective West, which finances the Ukrainian regime, bears no less and perhaps even more responsibility for everything that's happening. Representatives of Great Britain are particularly cynical and hypocritical, who diligently present themselves as the main benefactors of Ukrainian people, demanding that Russia withdraw its troops. They are not at all concerned about the scale of reprisals that the Ukrainian neo-Nazis would commit against the local population immediately after our departure, primarily against the hated Russians and the so-called collaborationists. At UN Security Council meeting on the UAV crash in Romania on June, the British representative said, and I quote, "Russia bears full responsibility for this escalation and for the growing threats to regional and Euro-Atlantic security. This incident is a direct result of Russia's illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which has caused the deaths of over 15,000 civilians since February 2022. In this regard, it's especially important to remind yet once again of an episode that is very eloquently shows the shameful role that London has played and continues to play in prolonging the conflict in Ukraine. In April 2022, the notorious Boris Johnson, then the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, rushed headlong to Kiev to prevent Russia and Ukraine from signing the peace agreement which had already been initialed in Istanbul. In this regard, I would like to ask a representative of the United Kingdom, so who is to be responsible for the death of 15,000 civilians, and at whose hands is the blood of tens of thousands of wounded and maimed Ukrainians? Hypocritically calling for peace, you and your accomplices from other European countries have done and continue to do everything to ensure that this bloodshed lasts indefinitely. Let me reiterate, if the Istanbul Agreement had been signed, the hostilities would have ended about a month after the start of the conflict. There would not have been so many dead and wounded. There would have been no destruction on the territory of Ukraine and Russia. There would have been no drones of the armed forces of Ukraine in the skies over Romania, Latvia, and other European countries, which our former Western partners slyly pass off as Russian. One thing is obvious to us. If the current European elites do not come to their senses and do not abandon the insane idea of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia, there will be inevitably more and more human casualties and destruction. Believe me, European countries which have suffered from the utmost degree of arrogance and their own exceptionalism since colonial times do not have a plan B. Mr. President, we cannot but comment on Zelensky's so-called open letter to President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, which is by no means a peace initiative, but a clumsy provocation designed to camouflage Kiev's desperate attempts to disrupt any talks to find ways to resolve the conflict. Under the guise of calling for a dialogue and hoping to get the media effect he wanted, Zelensky is only repeating all threats and propaganda cliches. Such unscrupulous maneuvers, which are moreover very clear and obvious, not only do not bring peace closer, but they only confirm the inability of the neo-Nazi gang entrenched in Kiev to negotiate. This message has already been commented on in Russia by the President, his press secretary, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Before writing such a so-called open letter, you should first cancel your own decree, which forbade you to negotiate with the President of Russia. And if you still want to talk, find a way to convey your desire discreetly and not with the help of loudspeaker diplomacy. However, as already mentioned, there is Zelensky regime which has openly embarked on the path of terrorism war. There is nothing to talk about with them. Imitation of negotiations and performances played out in public are alien to us. We seek a sustainable and lasting solution to the conflict. And as long as Kiev talks to us in the language which is rude and is an ultimatum, there is no way we can talk about real negotiations, even less about a summit meeting. Until Zelensky fully realizes the fallacy of his course, we will achieve our goals not by political and diplomatic, but by military means. Thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the delegation of the Russian Federation for the statement, and I give the floor now to the delegation of Liberia.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Undersecretary General and the Acting Assistant Secretary General for their updates. As we just heard, amid renewed intensification, we meet again as the war in Ukraine continues to exact a grave human and material toll, with serious consequences for international peace and security. We have been briefed that diplomatic premises and civilian infrastructure are increasingly being targeted. As this conflict endures, this Council must not allow either the suffering of civilians or the wider implications of this war to be treated as routine. We join the Secretary General, therefore, in strong condemnation of the intensification of this war. Liberia approaches this matter with a clear understanding of the lasting human, social, and institutional consequences of protracted conflict. Our own history reminds us that when war is prolonged, the effects extend far beyond the battlefield and are felt across generations. That experience informs our conviction that efforts toward de-escalation and a credible political path to cessation of hostilities must remain a priority of this Council. Mr. President, three hard realities astound our present meeting. First, the human cost continues to rise and the destruction to multiply. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has verified 15,850 civilians killed and 44,809 injured in Ukraine as of 30th April 2026, while making clear, as we just heard, that the actual figures are likely much higher. These are not just abstract numbers. They reflect lives lost, families shattered, and communities living under constant fear and sustained trauma. Second, the destruction of civilian and economic infrastructure has become a major long-term threat to stability and recovery. The Joint Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment issued by the World Bank, the United Nations, the European Commission, and the government of Ukraine estimates direct damage at over $195 billion over the next decade. It also finds that 14% of Ukraine's housing stock has been damaged or destroyed, affecting more than 3 million households. Third, the consequences of this war extend well beyond Ukraine. Its effects on food security, energy markets, development financing, and international stability continue to be felt acutely, including across Africa and the wider developing world. These wider repercussions remain part, if not the most important part, of this Council's responsibility and purpose for its existence. Mr. President, many have said, and it is worth repeating, there can be no military solution to this conflict. Liberia, therefore, calls for renewed commitment to political and diplomatic efforts to alleviate the human suffering, reduce the risk of further escalation, and help create the conditions for a just and lasting peace. As the Undersecretary General pointed out, it is not too late to pause and pull back from what has been described aptly by the Secretary General as a dangerous phase in this war. In this regard, all sides must recommit to the Charter of the United Nations and to its core principles, including respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. This is a responsibility we owe not only to our respective countries and regions, but to the wider international community. In closing, Mr. President, the Council's responsibility is not only to remain seized of this matter and conduct monthly briefings, but also to support efforts to end the war and advance the prospect for peace. Liberia reiterates its support for efforts toward de-escalation, cessation of hostilities, meaningful diplomacy, and a just and lasting peace in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations and strict obedience to international law. I thank you.
I thank the delegation of Liberia for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
Sayyid al-Rais.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and Mr. Ratwat, Acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator, for their valuable briefings. I also welcome Her Excellency Ms. Elina Valtonen, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland, and all the participants in today's session. Mr. President, this meeting is the fifth within 3 weeks to address the ongoing escalation in the Russia-Ukraine war, which underscores the urgent need to reach, as soon as possible, an immediate and lasting ceasefire and a comprehensive and sustainable diplomatic solution, and the need to engage in negotiations in good faith and with genuine political will to halt acts of violence, thereby contributing to strengthening security and stability in the European continent. In this context, the Kingdom of Bahrain expresses its concern over the escalation of violence and the intensification of military attacks in the Russia-Ukraine war, which have resulted in civilian casualties, including children, further aggravating the humanitarian suffering and deepening the consequences of this conflict. Mr. President, the Kingdom of Bahrain renews the Secretary General's urgent call for an immediate de-escalation, leading to a complete, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire. In this regard, the Kingdom of Bahrain emphasizes the importance of resuming talks between the United States of America, the Russian Federation, and Ukraine in a spirit of responsibility and serious political will. Building on the existing diplomatic momentum and efforts aimed at achieving a ceasefire and creating appropriate conditions for a sustainable political settlement of this conflict. The Kingdom of Bahrain also welcomes the success of mediation efforts undertaken by the United Arab Emirates between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, which resulted in a new prisoner exchange involving 370 detainees from both sides. The Kingdom of Bahrain supports all regional and international initiatives aimed at ending the war and alleviating its humanitarian consequences. Mr. President, the Kingdom of Bahrain stresses the need to ensure full protection for civilians and shield them from the effects of military operations, and the need to refrain from targeting civilian objects, infrastructure, and diplomatic premises. Such protection is guaranteed under international law and international humanitarian law and must be respected and adhered to under all circumstances. The Kingdom of Bahrain also expresses its deep concern over the increasing use of drones and ballistic missiles, targeting civilian and vital infrastructure, including residential buildings, educational institutions, energy facilities, and transportation and communication networks. This threat is not limited to the Russia-Ukraine war, but extends to other regions, including the Arabian Gulf, where critical civilian infrastructure has been and continues to be targeted by Iranian drones, most recently against the Kingdom of Bahrain and the sisterly state of Kuwait, which was condemned by the Security Council in its resolution 2817. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Kingdom of Bahrain reiterates its support for all efforts aimed at achieving a comprehensive, just, and sustainable solution that ends this devastating war and contributes to consolidating security and stability in Europe in accordance with relevant Security Council resolutions and the UN Charter, and in a manner that strengthens international peace and security. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of Bahrain for the statement. And now I give the floor to Somalia.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, we thank USG DiCarlo and OCHA acting ASG Ratwat for their comprehensive preference. As we gather here today, our delegation remains deeply concerned by the ongoing hostilities and the continued deterioration of both the humanitarian and security conditions in Ukraine. Current developments demonstrate that the longer this conflict continues, the longer human suffering is prolonged and the prospects for sustainable peace are diminished. We are concerned by the continuous escalation of military actions affecting civilian and critical infrastructure. Madam President, the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, including the preservation of schools, hospitals, and homes, are non-negotiable obligations enshrined in international humanitarian law. In this regard, we call on all parties to adhere to their obligations under international law and international humanitarian law. My delegation notes the recent positive humanitarian milestone achieved through dialogue, specifically the successful prisoners exchange on June 5th. This progress serves as a vital reminder that communication channels must remain open to alleviate human suffering. We reiterate that all parties must prioritize de-escalation, exercise utmost restraint, and commit to an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire. My delegation remains convinced that there is no military solution to this protracted conflict. Dialogue and diplomacy remain the sole viable means to bring this crisis to an end. A durable and just resolution must address the underlying root causes of the conflict and be fully consistent with the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. Lasting peace will require compromise, confidence-building measures, and a shared vision of common and sustainable security. In closing, Madam President, my delegation reaffirms its unwavering support for all diplomatic efforts aimed at achieving a resolution that restores peace, security, and stability. I thank you.
Le doy las gracias.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement, and I give the floor to the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam President, the Democratic Republic of the Congo thanks you for convening this emergency meeting. We also would like to thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Undersecretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs. We also thank Mr. Indrika Ratwate, Acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. We thank them for their comprehensive briefings. In the straight line of a correspondence sent to the Security Council these recent weeks, the last letter describes a worrying intensification of military operations, an escalation that the Democratic Republic of the Congo has been regretting ceaselessly. The letter also mentions the use of drones and missiles and illustrates how this conflict develops towards more and more sophisticated forms, but whose consequences, unfortunately, continue to be borne by the civilians. The briefings that we heard by the Political Affairs Department and by OCHA confirm yet once again the continued spiral of violence, the first victims of which are civilians. Madam President, the Democratic Republic of the Congo is following with a great deal of concern the recent developments in this war and the continued worsening of its humanitarian and material consequences. And in line with our position of principle, the Democratic Republic of the Congo reaffirms its unflagging commitment to the United Nations Charter, the international law, as well as to the international humanitarian law, which need to remain the foundation for any collective action so as to maintain international peace and security. My delegation would like to recall here the obligation on all parties to the conflict to protect the civilians as well as civilian infrastructure. This principle cannot be undermined, and the same applies to safe and unimpeded access to humanitarian assistance for the population in need, energy facilities, healthcare facilities, schools, supply chains, water supply chains, and all of the viable services cannot be targeted. Any attempt against such infrastructure is unacceptable because it is considered to be a violation of the core of the protections under international humanitarian law and human rights law. Madam President, the consequences having to do with the continuation of the conflict in the recent weeks is particularly heavy. Moreover, the increasing use being made of sophisticated military technology leads us to believe that there will be greater tragedies and material damage that we need to prevent, and we need to do that for the benefit of the people. Indeed, whilst the technology progress could have led us to believe that there would be greater distinctions and protections to civilians during hostilities, we must acknowledge that the damage done to the civilian populations and essential infrastructure remains high, considerable, and every day it pushes further away the prospects for a peaceful settlement. The Democratic Republic of the Congo would like to underscore yet once again that there is no lasting military solution to this crisis. Only a political and diplomatic settlement based on dialogue, good faith, and the respect of the principles in the United Nations Charter will open up a credible prospect for peace. And in this spirit, my delegation is of the view that an effective, verifiable ceasefire implemented in good faith is an indispensable stage if we want to see a resumption of the dialogue. A true cessation of hostilities would allow not only to immediately alleviate the suffering of the civilian population, but also will have progressively recreate the minimal conditions of trust that are needed for any serious negotiations. And in this regard, the Democratic Republic of the Congo takes note with interest of the various diplomatic initiatives and the proposals put forward towards a de-escalation and cessation of hostilities without prejudging the positions of the parties. We are of the view that any credible step that could reduce human suffering, could promote de-escalation, and recreate a minimum of trust needs to be encouraged and seriously considered. Madam President, to conclude, I would like to say that the Security Council cannot resign itself to just look at this war continue or accept that continued attempts at international law become a progressively banal reality. The longer the conflict goes on, the greater the human cost, and the more the prospect of lasting peace moves away. At the time when military technology is reaching a level of sophistication which is unprecedented, we need to collectively think of the paradox of the war that is not capable of sparing civilian suffering. Whatever the means used, no technology innovation can attenuate the basic reality of an armed conflict, namely that it will continue sowing death, destruction, and human suffering. The Democratic Republic of the Congo remains convinced that security does not come from the logic of permanent escalation. Only an effective ceasefire, restraint, and the use of diplomacy through inter alia, a candid dialogue between the parties to the conflict, will help create conditions for just, lasting peace in line with the principles of the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank you for the statement to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and I now give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Undersecretary De Carlo and Assistant Secretary Ratwat, for your briefings. Colleagues, the United States remains concerned by recent escalation in the Russia-Ukraine war, including Russia's mass drone and missile strikes last week, which resulted in over 20 civilian deaths and even more injuries. As Secretary Rubio made plain last week, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been a strategic disaster. Its oil refineries are ablaze, and Russia is now losing 5,000 people per month. Moscow cannot achieve its goals on the battlefield. Escalation will not change that, and only risks making the disaster worse. This war must end now. Enough is enough. It is unfortunate that talks to date have not produced the exchanges and concessions necessary to bring about peace. We urge both sides to immediately agree to a comprehensive ceasefire, leading to a negotiated end to the war. The cycle of retaliation, escalation, violence, and death must stop. We call on all UN member states to immediately cease support for Russia's war effort, as there is no military solution to this war. That includes Iran, which has supplied UAVs to Russia for use in Ukraine, and Cuba, which is prolonging the war by allowing thousands of mercenaries to fight on Russia's behalf. This war can only end with a negotiated settlement. The United States remains ready as ever, as we have repeatedly told both sides, to facilitate a durable end to this war. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I give the floor to China.
President, I thank USG DeCarlo and Acting ASG Ratwat for the briefings. As the Ukraine crisis continues to drag on, the conflict keeps intensifying on an escalatory spiral. The numbers from the battlefield are changing every day, with new strikes, new casualties, and new destructions of infrastructure occurring all the time. But one truth remains unchanged. Military means cannot bring about peace, and that allowing the conflict to continue will only take a greater toll. Meanwhile, diplomatic negotiations have recently stalled. We note the statements made by the leaders of the two parties regarding the resumption of talks and their divergent positions thereon. It speaks to the complexity of the underlying problems of the crisis, the difficulty of reaching a peace agreement, the vital and challenging path still ahead to a political settlement, and the need for unremitting efforts by all sides. In light of the current situation, let me make the following 4 points. First, we hope that the parties concerned will put their peoples first and keep exercising the utmost restraint to refrain from any action that may aggravate tensions and escalate conflicts, and to prevent the situation from spinning out of control. Second, we hope that all relevant sides will keep demonstrating patience, good faith, and flexibility, resume peace talks as soon as possible, and address the reasonable security concerns of one another with a view to reaching a comprehensive, lasting, and binding peace agreement. Third, we hope that countries in the region and the international community at large will amplify the voice of reason calling for the cessation of hostilities and talks for peace, and engage in greater diplomatic efforts to build trust and mediate a settlement, instead of fanning the flames or adding fuel to the fire. Fourth, we hope that all relevant sides will, in full compliance with the principles of the UN Charter, commit to resolving the root causes of the crisis, in order to shape a balanced, effective, and sustainable security architecture for the region. President, China's position on the Ukraine issue has all along been objective and impartial. Guided by the 4 points about what must be done put forward by President Xi Jinping, we have been actively engaged in shuttle diplomacy to work for peace and to facilitate talks. We will continue our efforts along with the international community to contribute positively to the political settlement of the crisis. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. And I now give the floor to Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo and OCHA ASG ad interim Mr. Indrika Ratwate for their briefings. We reiterate our full endorsement of Secretary General Guterres' call upon the parties to exercise restraint, eschew hostilities, and move towards a peaceful resolution of this conflict. More than a year ago, this Council adopted Resolution 2774, making a clarion call in favor of peace and the need to bring a swift end to this long-drawn conflict. We deeply regret that the momentum that could have been generated with the adoption of this resolution and that required a genuine commitment to peace from the parties could not take hold. Madam President, the recent escalation and the continuing vicious cycle of strikes and counterstrikes have brought nothing but more devastation and suffering across the conflict zone. Deplorably, civilians and civil infrastructure continue to face the brunt of this conflict. We are also alarmed by IAEA's report related to attacks around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and the potential threat to the safety and integrity of this nuclear facility. We hope that the parties would continue to fully adhere to the local ceasefire understanding in the area surrounding the ZNPP. We are deeply troubled by these developments that take place despite repeated and overwhelming calls by the international community for the respect of IHL and its principles. We underscore the need for the parties to abide by their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, without any exception. Intensification of fighting and expansion of battlefield will pull the parties further away from the path to peace. Military means cannot ensure lasting peace and will only prolong the agony of those affected by this conflict. To afford peace a real chance, primacy has to be given to dialogue and diplomacy, which remains the only path that can lead to a viable and sustainable peace and long-term stability in the region. In this context, we underscore the fundamental need for the parties to agree to an early and complete cessation of hostilities, allowing diplomacy the necessary space to work and bring this conflict to an early end. We reiterate our hope that the concerned parties would resume the United States-facilitated dialogue process at the earliest and engage meaningfully and constructively towards this end. Pakistan has all along favored and advocated the path of dialogue and diplomacy for the peaceful settlement of this conflict. This would require commitment to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and a focus on finding a mutually acceptable solution, corresponding to the legitimate security interests of all sides and the relevant multilateral agreements. To conclude, Pakistan will continue to support all efforts aimed at achieving a comprehensive, durable, and peaceful resolution of this conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement. I will now make a statement as the representative of Colombia. I thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, as well as Mr. Indrika Ratwat, Acting Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator for their briefings. I also welcome Her Excellency Elina Valtonen, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Finland, and I would also like to greet delegations that are present here. Colombia follows with deep concern in reports about the most recent wave of strikes in the context of the conflict in Ukraine, which have caused numerous civilian victims, including children, as well as caused significant damage to civilian infrastructures. What has happened in recent days confirms a trend that increasingly concerns us. The intensification of the use of long-range attacks against urban centers and highly populated areas. No military target can justify that communities continue to live under the constant threat of attacks, displacement, and destruction. If the reports that we have listened to today have taught us anything, it is that prolonging the conflict and the evolution of the tactics used on the ground have devastating consequences for the civilian population, which can no longer bear the consequences of over 4 years of war. That reality should move all the parties, and to that we add the accumulated deterioration of the civilian infrastructure, whose impacts go beyond the moment of the attack and continue affecting access to essential services for a long time after. Colombia would like to highlight the work of humanitarian, medical, and emergency personnel who continue to provide assistance in circumstances that are extremely difficult and dangerous. We reiterate the need to ensure safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access for those that are providing assistance to affected populations. We also insist on the importance of fully respecting obligations applicable to persons deprived of liberty with regards to the conflict. I apologize, says the speaker. Apply to persons deprived of liberty with regards to the conflict. Human trafficking of prisoners of war and access of international mechanisms that are competent on the matter constitute fundamental obligations in international humanitarian law and contribute to preserving a minimum space of humanity and dignity in the midst of war. The reality on the ground continues to show that there is no military solution to this conflict. More attacks, more destruction, and more suffering will not bring the parties closer to peace. Therefore, Colombia reiterates its call for an immediate, real and verifiable ceasefire that allows to reduce the suffering of the civilian population and create the conditions necessary to renew diplomatic efforts. It is urgent to reactivate effective channels for dialogue, to advance in specific measures in order to build trust and to support mediation efforts that allow for positions to come closer to each other. Colombia takes notes of recent public calls in order to renew contact and explore spaces for negotiation. We consider that any sign that points toward dialogue should be seriously examined and responsibly examined. In conflicts of this nature, opportunities for diplomacy are rare, and they should not be discarded. Peace will require political will. It will require dialogue. And it will require for the parties to once again bank on diplomacy. That is the path that Colombia will continue to champion in this council. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom who has requested the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, and I ask for the floor to respond to the accusations by the Russian Federation as they attempt to deflect from the focus today on the tragic loss of civilian life in Ukraine. We are sadly familiar with Russian attempts to use the Security Council to advance its disinformation and propaganda campaign, and today, as we have seen, is no exception. The UK has never prevented nor stopped any peace negotiation between Ukraine and Russia, nor could we. Why does Russia find it so hard to imagine that Ukraine as a sovereign country makes sovereign decisions? Ukraine's future is for Ukrainians to decide. This accusation comes from Russia, the country that illegally started the war, that illegally continues the war, that escalates this conflict, killing civilians in increasing numbers. Such deflection and disinformation is exposed by the fact that we continue to call for a ceasefire and a diplomatic solution, while Russia continues to reject any hope for peace. Thank you.
Gracias.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement. And now I would like to give the floor to the Russian Federation, please.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to respond to the representative of the United Kingdom and say you can try and come up with justifications as much as you want, try to shift the blame, try to convince everyone of being honest, but half of the world knows this saying, that according to which if two neighbors are fighting, that means that an Englishman had visited them yesterday, and many countries have paid a very heavy price for this piece of wisdom. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much for your statement. To the Russian Federation, I would now like to give the floor to Ukraine.
Madam President, Minister Valtonen, distinguished members of the Security Council, I thank the Colombian presidency for convening this meeting and express my deep gratitude to the delegations of Denmark, France, Greece, Latvia and the United Kingdom for supporting Ukraine's request. I also express my gratitude to the distinguished briefers, Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo and Acting Assistant Secretary General Indrika Redwet for Humanitarian Affairs for their horrific evidence of new monstrous war crimes committed by Russia in the last week alone against civilians in Ukraine. I will never tire of repeating that this horrendous evidence, officially presented before this chamber, will form part of future indictments and convictions, not only of every Russian commander and soldier responsible for these deplorable war crimes and crimes against humanity, but also of Russia's top political and military leadership. Madam President, before I move to my statement, I cannot let pass yet another torrent of fabrications, another stream of falsehoods, another flood of insinuations, another barrage of disinformation that has just been delivered by the Russian representative today. Though his script may change from time to time, but the plot remains exactly the same: to weave a web of lies, to deny the verified facts, to distort and bend the truth, to peddle fake narratives and distract from reality. So today, Mr. Nebenza has not surprised this Council and has not departed from his signature, imprudent style of spinning yarns. With an almost feverish intensity, he keeps repeating also today his worn-out concoction of Starobilsk. What we are hearing is the recycled told tale that keeps looping back like a broken record that refuses to stop. As the new Russia's victimhood myth of Starobilsk is being personally orchestrated by Mr. Putin, the representative of Russia cannot escape its gravitational pull. Thus, Mr. Nebenza and his team keep repeating with mechanical consistency, attempting to project new manufactured Kremlin storyline to this chamber as if the repetition alone could turn this fiction into fact. Even if the Russian representative were to submit to the Council yet another 100 letters, complete with staged images and pseudo-testimonies, all this would not add a single ounce of credibility to a completely fabricated narrative of Starobilsk. On the contrary, the more such cooked-up pieces of evidence are produced and circulated, the more this constructed story reveals itself as fully staged and devoid of any evidentiary value, exposing artificial nature. No visits of Kremlin-appointed court journalists to Starobilsk, no carefully choreographed pseudo-media pilgrimages can replace one fundamental fact. There is no independent verification whatsoever of these entirely baseless and frankly plucked out of the thin air claims. And this is all that members of the Security Council need to know about Starobilsk fake as well as other fake news accusing Ukraine, like today we heard about the alleged strike in Yanakiev, all staged, all unverified. Madam President, let me now proceed with my statement. Just 10 days ago, we met in this chamber to address Russia's unprecedented escalation of its war of aggression against Ukrainian civilians. Since the beginning of June, the brutality of Russia's attacks on the civilian population has once again set a grim new record of casualties and destruction. During the night of June 1 and continuing into the morning hours of June 2, the Russian Federation launched one of the most extensive and devastating combined aerial attacks against Ukraine since the start of its full-scale invasion. A total of 729 aerial attack assets were deployed, including 656 unmanned aerial vehicles and 73 missiles, among them 33 Iskander-M ballistic missiles, 27 101 cruise missiles, 5 Caliber missiles, and 8 Zircon hypersonic missiles, the most deadly ones. The scale and composition of this strike indicate a deliberate attempt to overwhelm Ukraine's air defense and maximize damage across urban areas. The primary direction of the attack was the city of Kyiv again, which suffered the most severe consequences in the last years. In the capital, at least 7 people were killed and around 80 were injured, including children. Apartment buildings in multiple districts were damaged or partially destroyed, and fires broke out across the city. Critical civilian infrastructure, including medical facilities, were affected, leaving parts of the city without electricity. In Dnipro, one of the hardest hit cities, at least 17 people were killed, including children and an emergency responder. More than 40 people were injured. A multi-story residential building was partially destroyed, with civilians trapped under the rubble during rescue operations. Extensive damage was recorded to residential buildings, civilian infrastructure, and public facilities. In Kharkiv, as well as in other regions, including Poltava, Sumy, Zaporizhia, and Chernihiv, Russian strikes caused severe injuries to civilians, damage to residential buildings, and disruption to infrastructure. Across Ukraine, during this latest heinous attack, more than 20 people were killed and over 120 were severely injured, including many children. Homes, hospitals, schools, warehouses, and energy infrastructure were damaged or destroyed, worsening the widespread impact on civilian life. Russian terror against civilians is ongoing and relentless. On June 3rd, nearly 200 drones attacked Ukraine. Next day, June 4, another barrage of almost 300 drones. And on June 5 and 6, again, more than 200 drones were launched each single day. Even while we are meeting here today, innocent people in Ukraine are paying with their lives. Just as this meeting got underway, a brutal Russian drone strike on the city of Zaporizhia killed 2 civilians at a bus stop, and 24 persons were injured. No diplomatic language can adequately describe the cruelty of such criminal acts. No military necessity can ever justify this barbarism. Madam President, let me now turn to the attention of this Council to the recent report of the Secretary General that has blacklisted Russia's armed and security forces as credibly suspected of committing rape and other forms of conflict-related sexual violence. What a shame. What a shame for this inglorious Russian army and the so-called law enforcement agency that are nothing else but a gang of rapists. Any ancient horde of barbarians was more human than today's Russian troops. For Ukrainians, these crimes, these outrageous crimes, are not new. They have been systematically documented since Russia's occupation of Crimea and parts of Donetsk and Luhansk in 2014. What has fundamentally changed now is that these appalling facts have now been independently verified and officially recorded by the United Nations. Let me quote from this report to give the Council a feeling of a country with which you must share this table. The Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine verified 310 cases of conflict-related sexual violence, including rape, gang rape, genital mutilation, electric shocks, and beatings to the genitals, affecting 280 men, 26 women, and 4 girls, perpetrated by Russian armed and security forces, including the Federal Penitentiary Service, the Russian Armed Forces, and the Federal Security Service, end quote. Madam President, the official response of Mr. Nebenza to this independently verified deplorable evidence which shocks human conscience follow the same shameless pattern as in the fake story of Starobilsk. Deny everything, distort the facts, attack the messenger, openly discredit Secretary General, and undermine a monitoring mission and system that was established by this very council. In a press conference a few days ago, Mr. Nebenza found this report biased. He found it poorly structured and formalistic, to use his own words. He asserted that the report failed to demonstrate the systemic nature of the alleged violations. Well, the Russian representative seems to be a demanding literary critic, though a rather selective one, given that Russia's government openly refused to cooperate with Special Representative Pramila Patten and denied access. Let me quote again from the SG report. One of 310 cases documented, 232 cases, or 74%, involved multiple forms of sexual violence, while 195 cases, 62%, involved multiple incidents of sexual violence, which was often used to punish or humiliate, to extract confessions, prisoners of war, and civilian detainees. A male prisoner of war was raped with a knife by Russian armed forces upon capture in 2022 and subsequently subjected to repeated sexual violence, including force, nudity, beatings, and electric shocks to the genitals, end quote. Mr. Nebenza is not here, even though he promised that he would sit when a Ukrainian representative is speaking, but he will follow up. Mr. Nebenza, at what percentage shall the pattern of war crimes related to sexual violence become systematic, according to Russia's very high standards of torturing innocent people? Dear members of the Council, how long are we going to tolerate these unacceptable attacks on Russia, on the legitimacy of the Secretary General, and as well as his special representative on the sexual violence and the crimes connected with the sexual violence? How long are we going to tolerate this story? May I make a creative suggestion? If Russia feels uncomfortable with all the decisions of the General Assembly demanding unconditional withdrawal of its troops, or better to say, its war criminals from the Ukrainian soil, if Russia rejects independent reports of relevant UN bodies exposing Moscow's barbaric policies, maybe it is time to say goodbye and get out of the UN. As we all know, the Russian Federation was never properly admitted to the UN. So I do not think that anyone in this chamber will be shedding tears when Russia finally slams the door and leaves. Every single day, the Russian representative is spitting in all our faces with his constant lies, while we too politely pretend that it is just falling rain. Madam President, let me remind the Council that Russia's armed forces have already been listed 3 consecutive times in the Secretary General report on children and armed conflict. Now Russia is listed under both flagship Security Council resolution, CAC, and conflict-related sexual violence. This designation cannot remain just a symbolic exercise. A military force that has been blacklisted by the Secretary General for conflict-related sexual violence cannot and shall not be a contributor to any operations under the UN flag. Russia's personnel shall be banned from UN peacekeeping and police missions. Madam President, while Russia fabricates baseless accusations on Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, it continues to endanger nuclear safety in reality. As we just heard today, on the night of June 6, a Russian drone struck a building at Ukraine's centralized spent fuel storage facility in Kyiv region, located within the Chernobyl area. That facility is used for the long-term storage of spent fuel from Ukrainian nuclear power plants. The strike caused a fire, which was extinguished by our emergency services. That was an attack on critically important nuclear infrastructure. Let us be clear, that was not incidental. That was deliberate and extremely dangerous act. And although radiation levels remain, thanks God, within normal limits, the incident demonstrates a further escalation in Russia's reckless behavior, which has long crossed all acceptable boundaries. Madam President, Ukraine has repeatedly demonstrated its commitment to peace. On June 4, the President of Ukraine addressed an open letter to Mr. Putin signaling the need to end this war and expressing readiness for direct negotiations. Ukraine has proposed a concrete path forward, a meeting of the two leaders on neutral territory. What we heard in response from Mr. Putin was "niet," again and again, "niet." Rather than showing readiness to start direct talks to end the senseless war, the Russian president declared during St. Petersburg Economic Forum that Russia was thriving and its economy was flourishing stronger than ever. Ironically, Mr. Putin did so against the backdrop of black smoke billowing from critically military facilities near St. Petersburg that had been struck by Ukrainian armed forces just hours before. The symbolism was hard to miss. We should better listen to the whining of Russian officials, the same people who for years lectured everyone about the supposedly unmatched resilience of Russia's economy and mocked sanctions as ineffective. Now, these very same figures are openly sounding the alarm and nervously looking for an off-ramp before the situation deteriorates even further. Russia's Minister of Economic Development, Maxim Reshetnikov, recently admitted that the country is facing a difficult situation, while Finance Minister Anton Siluanov warned about growing risks of budget deficit. Russian MP Renat Suleimanov openly acknowledged that the Russian economy may not withstand a prolonged war against Ukraine. Analysts agree that Russia's economy is approaching a point of structural stagnation. After years of wartime overheating, growth forecasts have now fallen towards roughly 1%. Inflation remains around 15% despite interest rate being pushed to nearly 20%. Reserve funds are being rapidly depleted. Budget deficit in the first quarter of 2026 alone exceeded $50 billion, overcoming the official target for the entire year. Oil and gas revenues, the backbone of the Russian budget, declined by roughly 40% in the first months of this year. For the last years, Russia sustained itself through its deathonomics, economic model that relied on war, militarization, and death itself as key drivers of economic activity. The Kremlin is now spending roughly $10 billion annually on military recruitment bonuses alone, while monthly compensation for deaths in combat can reach approximately $200,000 per soldier. Dying at the front has effectively become more financially rewarding than a lifetime of civilian work. But even this vile, distorted model is showing signs of exhaustion. Recruitment costs are rapidly increasing, inflation and labor shortages are worsening, civilian sectors continue to stagnate, and ever larger parts of the economy are being consumed by war. So in reality, Russia's economic situation is approaching a critical point despite the fact that its leadership continues to project forced optimism. On the battlefield, Ukraine could liberate in May 100 square kilometers more than Russian troops were able to advance for the second month in a row. Madam President, I would like to reiterate first the point that I made at our last meeting. Ukraine calls on our partner to scale up their support, particularly in the field of air defense, at least tenfold, better 20-fold. The most effective way to protect innocent lives today is to ensure that Ukraine has sufficient capabilities to intercept missiles and drones that Russia launches against our cities. Today, not tomorrow, not next month, not next year. Second, we urge all members of the United Nations to move beyond fragmented measures and adopt truly coordinated, comprehensive sanctions against Russia's war machinery. The target is clear: Russia's military-industrial complex, which continues to manufacture missiles, drones, and other weapons used to terrorize Ukrainian citizens on a daily basis. Every remaining channel through which critical technologies and components continue to reach Russia must be shut down. And third, I once again appeal to the members of the Security Council to place on the table, without further delay, a draft resolution calling for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, as well as the release and exchange of all prisoners of war and all civilian detainees under the all-for-all formula. Such a step could serve as an essential confidence-building measure and would contribute to establishing a more conducive environment for launching genuine negotiations in the near future aimed at achieving a comprehensive, just and lasting peace. Madam President, to conclude, I want to address the Russian representative with words from a famous Soviet cartoon which perfectly capture the current mood in Russian population that increasingly faces dire consequences of the boomerang of this barbarian war. Эх, жизнь моя жестянка, да ну ее в болото. All my life is so miserable. Let me throw it into the swamp. I thank you.
I would like to thank the representative of Ukraine for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Madam President. I regret the fact that I have to take the floor yet once again. All the more so since the accusations that are being put forward against my country, including to the very great regret with the assistance of some UN bodies, is not news. As regards the accusations of sexual violence, well, already in 2022, Pramila Pattern spoke very confidently about the fact that the Russian military personnel are allegedly committing sexual crimes under the influence of medication. Then he said that that was very difficult to verify, and her information was based on fragmentary data, but the media effect was already there. There was also a provocation in Bucha, where the blame was immediately placed on Russia. This was supported by the Secretary General, but not a single question that is being put by us regarding this situation we have received a response to. And every time these accusations, these made-up accusations are becoming increasingly fantastical. It would be desirable for them seemingly to be macabre or low physiology. For example, Mr. Melnik likes speaking about toilets and things like that. For several times now, we have heard from him that the Russian economy is falling apart, but Mr. Melnik, it has not fallen apart so far. You are saying that the Ukrainian army is capturing hundreds of kilometers and liberating, as you say, territories, but none of this has been confirmed. As regards the presence of Vasily Nebenza at our meetings, something that you just mentioned. Yes, did indeed he say that he always listens to your statements, but in recent times you have been requesting meetings far too frequently. There are also other, no less important things that he needs to take care of. Well, so enough is enough listening to that and convening such meetings, because it leads to nothing positive or constructive. I thank you.
I thank the Russian Federation for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ukraine once again. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Just a very short reaction. If Russia doesn't like what it reads in UN reports that were prepared by the Secretary General for methodology which has been agreed upon this Council, if you don't like what you read them, even if those facts is something that you would rather not see, that is not the problem of this Council. Again, Russia may choose and may leave this organization, and I think we would be feeling much better than listening to your constant lies. And regarding Bucha, I don't think that there is another war crime in modern history that has been better documented and that will be the final judgment for the political leadership in Russia, because Bucha is a shame that not just your government, but the Russian people will bear for decades and for centuries. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much to the representative of Ukraine for the statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Elina Valtonen, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Finland.
Madam President, thank you to the two briefers. I have the pleasure to speak today on behalf of the Nordic countries Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Finland. Russia's decision to launch its full-scale invasion of Ukraine was one of the biggest strategic mistakes of the 21st century. It was also a blatant violation of international law and the very principles upon which the United Nations was founded. More than 4 years later, Russia has failed to achieve its objectives. No quick gains, no strategic wins. Instead, it continues to pay a staggering price in human lives and military resources. In the month of May alone, Russia itself reportedly suffered more than 30,000 casualties on the battlefield. Such disregard for human life stands in stark contrast to the values and human rights we have collectively committed to uphold. As Russia intensifies its aerial attacks against Ukrainian cities and civilians, it has also escalated its rhetoric. Russian officials have openly threatened civilians, diplomats, and the staff of international organizations operating in Ukraine. The Nordic countries strongly condemn these statements. Russia does not dictate our diplomatic presence in Ukraine. Yet, while Russia escalates, Ukraine endures. As a UN member, it has an inherent right to defend itself in accordance with Article 51 of the Charter. As a nation under constant attack, Ukraine has demonstrated extraordinary resilience, innovation, and courage. It has strengthened partnerships across Europe and beyond, becoming a leader in defense innovation, all the while upholding its commitments under international law. At immense human cost, Ukraine has reminded us all of a fundamental truth. Peace cannot be preserved without security, and security requires credible defense. Madam President, it is the responsibility of this Council to safeguard peace and security. The Ukrainian people have made their wishes unmistakably clear. They want peace. Last week, President Zelensky called for an immediate ceasefire and direct talks between the leaders of Ukraine and Russia. The Nordic countries support this call. A ceasefire must be the first step towards a just, lasting, and sustainable peace. President Putin, the path to peace is clear. End this war now. Withdraw Russian forces from Ukraine, respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Uphold international law. The Nordic countries want peaceful relations with Russia, but peace cannot be built on aggression, coercion, or the subjugation of a people. It can only be built on respect for the UN Charter, for sovereignty, and for the rules that protect all nations, large and small. That is the choice before Russia today. I thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Valtonen for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, head of the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the EU and its member states, the candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Georgia, as well as Andorra and Monaco, align themselves with this statement. I thank you, Madam President, the Colombian presidency for convening this meeting. Thank you to the briefers for their updates. Colleagues, the interventions of this Council were still echoing in this chamber last Monday, as we gathered in response to a Russian drone strike in Romania, when Russia was already launching another massive airstrike against Ukrainian cities and the population. With wave after wave of deadly long-range strikes against civilians, Russia attempts to compensate for 4 years of systematic setbacks on the battlefield. It threatens diplomatic representatives in Kiev. It strikes humanitarian workers and compounds. These attacks, all in flagrant violation of international law, are a concern to us all. No one believes Russia when it pleads that it is striking mainly military targets. Already on the blacklist of countries violating children's rights in conflict, and with President Putin under an ICC arrest warrant, Russia has now also been listed by the UN Secretary General for conflict-related sexual violence. From these egregious violations of international law, Russia keeps trying to run, but it has run out of places to hide. These violations and the attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure must cease. Colleagues, we often hear Russia in this chamber complain about an alleged lack of empathy for Russian casualties in this war, conflating, as it so often does, aggressor with victim. But speaking of empathy, where's the Kremlin's empathy for the estimated 1,000 Russian soldiers it sends to injury and death every single day in the unprovoked and unjustified war that it chose for more than 4 years now to wage against Ukraine? And for the 60,000 Ukrainian civilian casualties, as verified by the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission, that it has chosen to kill or maim? This bloodshed must stop now, and Russia must end its war of aggression and engage in serious peace negotiations without any further delay. So why doesn't it? And why does it not accept a full, unconditional, and immediate ceasefire and genuine talks for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter and relevant UN resolutions? We all read the letter from President Zelensky last Thursday. We have all heard this call repeatedly from the UN Secretary General and from the overwhelming majority of UN members. The European Union supports it and all diplomatic efforts to this end, and we once again urge all members of this Council to please ensure that Russia's leadership accepts a ceasefire and engages in good faith. Russia must abandon, for that, its illegal and maximalistic goals against Ukraine, and it must sit down to talk. And it must stop the attacks and the killings. Enough is enough. Time for a ceasefire is now. Until then, and as Ukraine beats back an aggressor and stands up for its sovereignty as an independent state, it must be able to count on our full support as it exercises its inherent right to self-defense in line with Article 51 of the Charter. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Lambrinidis, for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Germany. You have the floor.
Madam President, thank you very much, and thank you for convening this important meeting. Thank you, Under-Secretary General Di Carlo and Assistant Secretary General Ratwate, for your insightful briefings. Germany aligns itself with the statement just delivered by the European Union. Russia's latest massive strikes against Ukrainian cities mark yet another dangerous escalation in its war of aggression against its sovereign neighbor. And once again, Russian bombs have killed and injured innocent civilians. Indiscriminate attacks on civilian infrastructure demonstrate a deliberate pattern of state-sanctioned terror entirely unjustified under any military pretext. Threats against diplomatic missions and foreign citizens in Kiev are a concern to all of us. It is unacceptable, and we utterly condemn it. Russia's shift towards increasingly reckless warfare highlights, above all, one clear fact: it is unable to advance on the ground, yet remains unwilling to end its war. Madam President, President Zelensky has offered an immediate ceasefire as a first step on the path to meaningful negotiations. Last Thursday, we heard it, he published an open letter suggesting a face-to-face meeting in a renewed bid to end the war in Ukraine. However, his offer was immediately refused. How can one defend choosing aggression over diplomacy? There's no justifiable reason, whether on ethical grounds or under international law, to turn down the offer of a ceasefire and of peace talks. And the cynical attempt by Russia to deflect the attention from who started this war here today in many ways, also by accusing European countries of a lack of empathy for civilian casualties, cannot and will not succeed. Colleagues, we urgently call upon all member states to join us and others in sending this clear message to Russia. Enough is enough. End this abhorrent violence, halt your rockets, and agree to a ceasefire. And let me assure you, together with our European partners, Germany stands ready to support and sustain a process towards substantial peace talks. But at the same time, let there be no doubt, Germany, together with its European and transatlantic allies, will neither rest nor relent until freedom, peace, and security for Ukraine are restored. We reaffirm our continued and unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Ukraine will remain resilient, as our support will be unshakable. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany for the statement, and I now give the floor to Poland.
Madam President, at the outset, I thank Colombia for convening this meeting and the briefers for their informative interventions. Madam President, Poland once again takes the floor on the situation in Ukraine, having already addressed this issue twice in this Council in recent weeks. The frequency with which we are called upon to return to this matter is not a choice for Poland, nor for the Council. It is a direct result of the actions of the Russian Federation. As a permanent member of this body, Russia bears particular responsibilities, yet its conduct continues to compel the Council's attention and response. At a time when Russia escalates its unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine, I wish to highlight three key points that deserve, in our opinion, the Council's particular attention. First, once again, we gather in the aftermath of the series of extremely brutal Russian airstrikes, that the scale of which is unprecedented in the entire war. Russia launched a barrage of drones and missiles targeting multiple Ukrainian cities, including Kiev. Dozens of people were killed and well over 200 injured. We reject Russia's cynical attempt to frame these attacks as legitimate military responses. These strikes are part of a sustained campaign against civilians, causing repeated harm to apartment blocks, schools, medical facilities, and other civilian objects, with children among the dead and wounded. We particularly appalled at the recent remarks by President Putin, who called the recent strike by the Oreshnik missiles as a mere test. It speaks volumes that the President of the Russian Federation, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, views attacking urban areas and killing and injuring civilians as an experiment. This Council has to name it for what it is, a terror campaign against the civilian population, a campaign which constitutes a war crime and whose perpetrators must and will face justice. Second, we do not see any changes in Moscow's position on peace. The world is calling for dialogue. Ukraine is ready to negotiate, yet Russia continues time and again to refuse to engage in talks and sets conditions that serve merely as a pretext to avoid negotiations. Clearly, the Kremlin shows no interest in ending the war and aims to achieve its maximalist goals on Ukraine. The timing of the recent strikes exposes Moscow's true intentions at the negotiating table. These attacks are a part of an escalating pattern, demonstrating that Russia continues to rely on violence and intimidation rather than diplomacy. Third, Russia's attacks on civilian areas are aimed not just at Ukraine. We can see that in our region almost every day now. Moscow continues to spread fears or concerns across the world and seeks to undermine and ultimately destroy the international order based on international law and principles that protect all states, especially smaller ones. This deliberate strategy poses a direct threat to global stability and security far beyond Ukraine and our region. Russian propaganda is also active, sowing seeds that create excuses for expanded aggression. This very Council, the world's key body for peace and security at the heart of the United Nations system, must fully recognize this threat and respond to it with the gravity it demands. Madam President, in conclusion, we firmly reiterate our appeal. It is time for Russia to end this illegal, brutal, and unsustainable war. The path to peace does not lie in terrorizing civilians, but in cessation of hostilities, the protection of Ukraine, and the restoration of respect for international law. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Lithuania.
President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Baltic states, and we also align with the statement of the European Union. From the outset, I would like to thank the Colombian presidency for scheduling this council meeting to address yet another wave of Russia's deliberate attacks on civilians in Ukraine. Once again, Russia's massive barrage targeted critical infrastructure and residential neighborhoods across multiple cities. Use of hypersonic missiles such as Zircon and other explosive weapons against residential areas, hospitals, schools, and critical civilian infrastructure is a violation of international humanitarian law. Yet, such attacks do not weaken Ukraine's determination at defense, alter the course of the war, or bring Russia closer to victory. They are not a sign of strength, but an admission of a strategic failure. The Baltic states call on all UN member states to join us in seeking justice for all victims of Russia's war and accountability for all those responsible. The inclusion of Russia's armed forces in the annex to the Secretary General's report on conflict-related sexual violence highlights this. The Baltic states will continue to stand with Ukraine, including by providing military support, underpinning Ukraine's right to self-defense against the ongoing aggression. We will work together with our partners in NATO and the EU, also building our own resilience and defense against Russia's threat. President, last week Russia's president has rejected President Zelensky's call for direct face-to-face talks. Moreover, in a public meeting with the press, President Putin also admitted that in its recent use of nuclear-capable Oreshnik missile, Russia did not follow military necessity, but simply struck, and I quote, where it was convenient, in order to make decisions in the future about the full-scale use of Oreshnik against designated targets, including in urban areas. Silence or inaction in the face of such escalation risks sending a dangerous message that deliberate attacks against civilians can be carried out without consequences, further undermining international peace and security. We call on the Council to work together on a resolution for an immediate, full, and comprehensive ceasefire, in line with the UN Charter. Such a resolution is essential to protect civilians and to open space for negotiations towards just and sustainable peace. Ukrainian people, especially prisoners of war, illegally detained civilians, and illegally deported Ukrainian children must remain at the center of any such negotiations. The Baltic states reaffirm our unwavering support for independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, with its international recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Lithuania for the statement. There are no further names inscribed in the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.